history, there are moments of new normal. So I'm curious, putting this book together, what determines a new normal versus a never normal?
Well, you mentioned, of course, September 11th, and that was what you might call a black swan event. And I guess, the pandemic, which was, the greatest health crisis since the Spanish flu of 1918, could also be considered a black swan event. But they were shocks. They were ephemeral. They were fleeting, okay? What I'm talking about is not a shock. What I'm talking about is a fundamental change in the way that our economies are going to operate. And the most fundamental of those changes is trade is no longer based on comparative advantage or cost. Trade is based on geopolitics. So the foreign policies of a country is going to determine who it trades with. And that's a very, very different world than the world that we know. I mean, China was a rival of the United States, but they were both mutually in the same system. And it was Bill Clinton who first got China into the WTO because they wanted to have access to a huge cheap labor market. Nobody can appreciate that better than Apple, for example, and Apple is by no means alone. So we're talking about a whole different way of reorganizing the economy. And while, central bankers will get up and take bows for managing inflation with their prudent monetary management, they're on the sidelines. What really brought inflation to its knees were the trade negotiators, first with the WTO. And because what it did was it meant that you could replace high wage labor with low wage labor, and that was, we've availed ourselves for decades of consuming the fruits of cheap overseas labor, because just about everything that we consumed was made by some sweatshop on the other side of the ocean. That world's gone. So everything that we're gonna make here that we used to import from China is gonna cost a multiple of what we're accustomed to pay. Now, there's a flip side to that coin, and there's a silver lining for some of us. Because at the same time, factory jobs, decent paying middle class factory jobs that we thought were gone forever and would never come back, they're coming back. They're coming back, and all of a sudden, workers have bargaining power, and all of a sudden, the middle class is going to start to grow. So, that's the kind of trade-off that is being made here, but that is almost a throwback to the economy that we would have known, like in the 1960s, where most of the things that we consumed were actually made here, but by high-wage domestic labor.
So on that, are we in a country like Canada or our neighbors to the south, the US, ready to pay for the real cost of things if made by people in our community?
Well, you see, right now it's hard for people to see because they're looking at things through the fog of war. And by that I mean, we think that propaganda is the exclusive domain of authoritarian countries. But think again. I mean, Gulf of Tonkin, Vietnam War, Saddam Hussein, weapons of mass destruction, 100,000 Iraqis get killed, when the US, wiped out Iraq with its missiles, was shock and awe, testament to the precision of US military guided weapons. But when Russia does the same to Ukraine, it's barbarous and war crimes. So when different standards are applied to different actors, we have what is called propaganda. And in a wartime, and make no mistake about it, we are at war. Propaganda serves only one purpose: to galvanize public support for the war effort. Hence, it's Putin's war. Like, he's the only person out of 144 million Russians who's taken exception to the fact that NATO's doubled after assuring Gorbachev that they wouldn't, advance 1 inch. Or President Xi is the only one of 104 billion Chinese who think that Taiwan is part of China, even though it has been since the 17th century. Well, getting to the inflation side, you're not hearing any central banks saying, forget about the 2% inflation. The world has changed, and high inflation is part of the new normal. We're pretending that it's a temporary phase, and that's a major miscalculation because the 2% inflation target, which is the inflation target of the Bank of Canada and the Federal Reserve Board and the Reserve Bank of Australia and the EU and the Bank of England, that relates to a very, very different economy. The pre-pandemic economy is an entirely different animal than the sanctions-ridden economy of today. And I don't think that wages are growing at 6%, that it's sustainable to have 2% inflation. So let's not make policy choices like slowing down the economy to create unemployment to bring inflation down, if in fact our inflation target is not obtainable anymore on a sustainable basis. And that message has not yet been received by our central bankers as they carefully manage monetary
So we need new propaganda for the public to understand the rising costs?
Yeah, I don't even think that this book could have been published 2 years ago. Because, in the media, the conflict is a biblical conflict between good and evil. Whereas
we like binaries in the media, I will say this.
Whereas I'm saying, the United States doesn't spend on its military more than the GDP of Africa simply to protect world democracy. There are other motivations here. This isn't good versus evil. This is Game of Thrones, so.
Now, you mentioned globalization. It comes up a lot, especially early in the book, as it relates to COVID, but also, as you've mentioned, the jobs that have moved overseas and are likely to move back in this new world order. How does that connect back to supply chain issues, sanctions, and did we learn the right things from COVID in regards to policies? Because I will say that's where so many of us were worried about getting medicine. We're stocking up on a range of items. Even, you mentioned your book, it was a hard time to get a bicycle. It was really in our face during COVID, and are we better prepared?
Well, COVID, as I mentioned, was the first time that we began to question the efficacy of global supply chains. And that, of course, has now gone on to a much greater level with sanctions. But COVID is something else. It left, its legacy was a powder keg, just waiting to be lit. You see, deficits exploded during COVID. In Canada, the deficit went from around 30 billion to over 300 billion, like a tenfold increase in the deficit. Usually, when deficits explode, the cost of borrowing also explodes. The principle is called supply and demand, and it works to affect the government bond yield like it does the price of anything else. And that's what always in the past would keep government spending in check, because if you just spent crazy, then all of a sudden your debt servicing costs would balloon because you'd have to pay this huge interest rate to place the bonds, and that more and more tax revenue would go to bondholders instead of vote-getting program spending. That's not without its electoral consequences. But the exact opposite happened. During the pandemic, the yield on, say, a 10-year Government of Canada bond fell to a record low 0.5%. And not to get too technical here, I know this isn't a fixed income audience, but the yield and the price of a bond are inversely related. So when the yield's at an all-time low, the price of the bond is at an all-time high. So you might ask yourself, who's buying these bonds? You know, normally it would be a pension plan, an insurance company, or retail investors. But why would they pay record premium prices for low yields to finance unheard of size deficits? Well, they weren't. They weren't the ones buying. The Bank of Canada was buying. They were buying at the tune of $3 billion a week. By the end of the pandemic, they owned almost 50% of all the government bonds issued. So you might ask yourself, where'd they get the money to buy all these bonds? Simple. They just printed it. It's called quantitative easing. The late, I guess,
I hear nervous laughter.
Yeah.
the late great, I never liked him at the time, but the dictum runs very true. The late great American economist Milton Friedman, the father of the Monetary School of Economics, famous dictum was, inflation is everywhere and at all times a monetary phenomenon. And those words have never rung truer. The money supply in Canada grew at 40% during the pandemic, about 6 to 7 times its natural rate of growth. And I liken it to creating a powder keg, just waiting to be lit. And sanctions against Russia that sent oil prices and food prices soaring blew that powder keg sky high. And what's left with that is the inflation that you see today. So that has been one of the lasting legacies of the pandemic.
Do you think we will be better equipped because there likely will be another pandemic in regards of Canada's needs within the country?
Well, I think we will be better positioned to make our own respirators and vaccines and masks. In fact, I'll go for, we just won't make that. We'll make a whole range of goods that we haven't made for years. And yes, you see, the new mantra of the economy today, in the old economy, you were supposed to specialize in what you were good at, okay? In this world, the new world order, the economy has to be a jack of all trades. You know, you have to satisfy your domestic needs with your own production, or the production of your friends. But that's entirely different than the way our economies were organized for the last 40 years, is that we just want to be specialists in what we're good at. Ricardo's theory of comparative advantage.
So building off that, I'd like to talk about hunger. You bring it up in your book. It connects back to sanctions. And food security is a top global issue in a way that might even surprise people here in Canada, for us.
Yeah, the late Henry Kissinger, Secretary of State of the United States, once quipped, control oil and you control nations. Control food and you control people. Let me give you an example. There's 2.5 million people in Cairo who drive cars, but all 20 million eat. And guess where they get their grain from? I think that in the end, Russia has greater leverage from its grain exports than its energy exports, because Russia is the #1 grain exporter. And these days, those kind of countries have a lot of hungry friends, particularly in the Middle East, which is singularly dependent on Russian grain. And you'll notice no African country condemned the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Who do you think the second biggest grain exporter is? It's us, Canada. And guess what? Both Russia and Canada are benefiting from global climate change. because the growing seasons are being extended. Right now, you can grow corn and soybean on the prairies. You could never do that before. So Russia and Canada's leverage is going to grow. What happens if Russia does its version of friendshoring? What happens if Russia says, we're only going to sell our grain to our friends and let other countries starve? You know, I mean, food is definitely a warfare front now. And our enemy just happens to be the largest grain exporter in the world and who climate change will favor going forward as far as grain production.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to speak to the climate crisis. We now have mainstream language and goals for targets and a path perhaps to net zero, but there are big challenges outlined throughout your book. The cost of heating homes, especially in Europe, the cost of energy at large, the slow move to alternative energy, how that connects to other countries, but also coal, nuclear. In this new normal, what are the biggest factors truly holding back our progress in addressing the climate crisis, which we know will also have devastating impacts on the very issues we've just addressed?
Well, I would say that next to energy prices themselves, the biggest casualty of the sanctions imposed against Russian energy are our efforts to mitigate climate change. Because when people wonder if the lights will come on when they flick the switch, or if they'll be able to heat their homes in the winter, as they did in Germany, then concerns about global climate change quickly take a back seat to the overriding concern of energy security. Now, when sanctions were first imposed, they came with thick coats of greenwash. Since Russia was Europe's major supplier of fossil fuels, it was argued, this will simply accelerate the transition to, renewable solar wind power. It did the opposite. What replaced Russian natural gas was not wind, was not solar. It was coal. All of a sudden, coal is having a remarkable renaissance, not in so much India and China, but in Germany, okay? In the UK, the British Parliament just passed a law for the first time in 30 years licensing a new coal mine because they expect that the thermal demand for coal is going to be so strong. So it's totally created, all of the environmental goals have been, while the government still pays lip service to them, emissions are rising. And of course emissions are rising because they're going back to coal. They were supposed to close their last 3 coal plants. Instead, they've reopened 10 mothball plants, and Germany's not alone. Now let's talk about us. President Biden, he likes to consider himself, big environmentalist. And he's got some pretty, ambitious environmental goals, like decarbonizing the power grid by having solar and zero emission vehicles by, 2030. Well, you can't do that when all of a sudden you don't let solar panels in from China, and they only produce about 90% of the world's solar panels. And just last week, 100% tariff on electric batteries from China. I wonder how that's going to play with the ZEV targets that he has. So Washington has totally sacrificed its environmental objectives to try to inflict economic pain on China. Will future administrations make the same choice? I don't know. I know one thing though, that if we're concerned about BRICS' power over fossil fuels, BRICS are in a way stronger position in terms of the renewables and solar. Like the biggest nuclear provider in the world by a country mile is Rostodon, Russia's nuclear power plant. They do cradle to the grave. I mean, they'll design the reactor plant, they'll run it, they'll provide the uranium, they'll decommission it. Where reactors are being built are all through the developing world. If nuclear replaces coal, Russia's going to be the Saudi Arabia of nuclear. And when it comes to, you know, solar panels, China may be a laggard in terms of its own emissions, but it's been very prescient about how the world will, you know, what will be required for the world, and it makes sure that it has 80% of rare earth elements, you know. It's so, you know, will we still choose economic warfare over environmental emission reductions in the future as the consequences of global warming become more severe? You know, that's a dilemma that future administrations are going to have to face. But, you know, this is being done not by the Trump administration, who doesn't believe climate change is for real. This is being done by the Biden administration that supposedly champions environmental concerns.
I have one final question, and then we're going to open it up to the audience. Next week, I'm speaking at the Canadian Vote Summit, which is taking place at Toronto Metropolitan University, and it's focused on elections and democracy. This is a big election year around the world, and I want to know, what role do citizens play in this emerging new normal when it comes to voting power, be it in South Africa right now, India, you mentioned the US, big news today with 34 felony charges against Donald Trump. Curious what you think. Regular people, voters can do anywhere in the world.
This is what I think. I think it's kind of interesting that America, that champions itself as the defender of democracy, yet most Americans, certainly most Republicans, have zero confidence in the democratic institutions of our country. And you might go gleefully, 34 felony charges against Trump. On the other side, the judiciary, the FBI, have been weaponized. And that's American democracy. And, you know, are we really fighting to preserve democracy in Ukraine? When was there an election in Ukraine? Oh, I forgot. The election was canceled. And is there any opposition? No, all political parties have been banned. They're simply instruments of Putin. So, I don't know what the future of democracy is. Maybe democracy has a better future in BRICS, but certainly in America, a growing number of Americans do not believe in the institutions of their democracy. And after November, maybe even more.
Yeah, and we know research shows in Canada, trust is down not only in institutions, but also in media, in corporations, in places of worship. So yeah, absolutely. All right, we're turning it over to you.